Thanks everyone for being here today. My name is Alex Hersham. I'm the CEO of Zencargo. Bear with me a little bit as I come into the light, get blinded for a second, and come out of the light, so I do apologize in advance. Small but Mighty is a great title, actually. I've got to credit some of the guys in my organization for coming up with it. And we're going to be speaking about how SKU-level insights can supercharge your supply chain. Just starting on Zencargo, back in 2017, I wanted to start a freight forwarding company. And in hindsight, I thought I wanted to start a freight forwarding company. I spent years building a shipping business, and I thought I could make it better. What I learned, though, in this area of trade is that you can't disconnect technology from supply chain. And the idea of freight or technology, it's freight and technology. And data plays a huge role in supply chain management. And Zencargo has really been built around that idea of how do we make the most effective option for any business needing freight forwarding services. As you can see from up here, we're quite humbled to already be working with 30% of the fastest growing e-commerce businesses across the country. We recently won the BIFA Award for Supply Chain Management a couple of weeks ago, and were nominated as one of the ones to watch by the Sunday Times. The one thing I keep on hearing in conversations with supply chain leaders is data, and actually too much data. People are getting a bit frustrated with what they have available to them, and so what I want to do today is simplify it and just talk about one data point, which is the SKU. Before we get onto that, coronavirus, something that's very topical. Just a quick show of hands, I wonder whose supply chain here is affected either partially or significantly by the coronavirus outbreak. I would say great, but it's obviously very challenging. Production issues are clearly having both first generation and second generation effects. There's issues around not only POs but SKUs, and as we're working with our clients to try and create strategies to sort of circumvent the impact, it's clearly quite challenging at the moment. And I think it's even more challenging when supply chains have to look at it across a couple of different verticals. Do you focus on the container level? Which containers do I need to move? Do you focus on the PO level? Which POs are at risk? Which are hot POs? Which are cold POs? Which can I afford? Do you look at trade lanes and which routes do I need to update? Do you look at suppliers and how do I near source? Which suppliers are affected? Which suppliers are affected? Looking back to sort of tier 2 supply chains. And from my perspective, there's a way that we can simplify it. And how do we simplify it? We look at it all from the SKU perspective. And so the view from the SKU. And the beautiful thing about the SKU is it's the simplest form of a supply chain unit. It's what the customers buy. It's what your manufacturers make. It's what your commercial teams order and then chase to be transported down, sometimes to your detriment. And so the question that we always have is, why don't more businesses make SKU management the foundation of supply chain management rather than PO or shipment management the foundation? Some businesses do. And actually, some of the businesses that do are the ones that are really succeeding in today's age. So let's look a bit more at SKUs in practice. What makes a good supply chain fail? I think starting with the obvious, and all supply chains are different, but when they go wrong, they tend to hit the same common places. Firstly is missed sales. Whether it's stock outs of high-selling SKUs or hot SKUs, whether it's new product launches that had to get delayed and got slowed down. This is one of the key areas where in elongated supply chains, a supply chain can really fail. Higher landed costs, and it obviously interrelates quite significantly with missed sales, whether it's driven by accelerating a whole purchase order rather than accelerating a couple of SKUs and air freighting it over and then seeing it sit in the warehouse for a couple of weeks, which is more than just anecdotal. Whether it be around consolidation, around D&D at destination, there's significant ways in which higher landed costs can be crept up through death by 1,000 cuts across the supply chain. Working capital, I'm sure we've all seen this in our businesses, over-ordering for stock buffer, or when goods come in and the merchandising team is looking at their WYSI, they have some items which are suffering from the top, approaching stock outs, others that actually have very healthy or too healthy inventory, and actually they have too many weeks cover. And then last but not least, and it all interrelates, is unnecessary emissions, with a reliance on air freight and inefficient consolidation. And actually, when you look at this together, what we see a lot is some circularity between them. Sometimes it starts at the top with missed sales that then leads to a pushback on supply chain in terms of accelerate more or consolidate less, which leads to sort of lower PO optimization or container optimization, which drives higher landed costs. Higher working capital again, sometimes when teams that are focused on selling the inventory get worried about what's coming in, they overorder, and unnecessary emissions is a byproduct of that sort of circular trend. And so when we look at sort of the key value areas on ways in which, and we'll go through these in detail, ways in which we can improve supply chain management, collaboration is obviously key, creating a common language, a common framework across the organization. Planning in terms of using data that's actually readily available, and the part that I'm most excited about, execution. Working with your partners to make sure that you're being nimble and adjusting in real time. If we start with collaboration, commercial and merchandising teams raise POs, think about SKUs, and are really worried about what's coming in, when's it coming in, and how's that going to affect my WYSI. Logistics teams tend to look at it on a container level, a PO level, they look at it on a trade lane level. And then the warehousing teams, stock and SKUs. What's coming in? How's it going to affect my warehouse management? How's it going to affect D&D at port of arrival because of sort of clogs in my warehouse? And actually, SKU level enables the best type of communication, which is clear and unambiguous communication. A really simple example is slowing down a container, which will really help the logistics team in terms of their sort of overall cost in their logistics organization. Slowing down a couple of orders, merging them in a container might look great to one stakeholder in an organization with obvious knock-on effects. It actually will delay some SKUs in arriving because it has to go into a CFS, so you have to wait for another PO to be ready. And so sort of pulling this all together and allowing a common framework for these crucial teams that really have to collaborate inside an organization to succeed is how collaboration can really enable successful supply chains. Then when it comes to planning, there's a whole host of areas that data can be really effective. When it comes to how long does a SKU take to produce, who produces it reliably, landed cost, etc. When you're looking at it across how does it affect my end-to-end gross margin, not just my landed cost, and my consolidating effectively, there's all these rich data points that can really help you plan and iterate on planning. And then when it comes to execution, here's where a lot of the fun happens, right? Let me sort of pull down some of these slides. So there's expediting. We should move to a world where we're expediting the SKUs that we want, not the POs that we want, and consolidating the rest. When it comes to flexible consolidation, knowing what you need and when you need it can actually allow smart consolidation to happen consistently in origin and not be pulled by the needs of merchandising downstream, because you can understand what's happening with SKUs. When it comes to rerouting, we actually do this quite often for clients when they have multi-DCs and it's coming in and you want to reroute it to go to the closest DC to the client. And so across these ideas around execution, again, speaking about the SKU really enables targeted, appropriate SKU-level decision makers. And done together, this can really give you back control over cost, over revenue, over working capital, and over emissions. So the SKU and you. I think one thing that I see, and perhaps you will see as well in the organization, is that the loudest voice often ends up being the one that dominates the conversation. And in supply chains where actually the purpose of a supply chain is to bring in SKUs to then either do something with it but effectively then sell it, it's typically demand that tends to be the loudest voice, and sometimes appropriately so, but it's not the whole story. And actually, when you think about all the data points that lie behind a SKU, whilst demand is the loudest voice, there are other things to consider. And that might be, there might actually be reasons to delay a movement, and there might be something coming up that you can consolidate. If you accelerate goods and it arrives in a port because you really wanted to pull them, but then the DC doesn't have the space to then have intake, you're accruing D&D. As I mentioned a moment ago, consolidation. And there's no sort of right or wrong answer here, but it's really coming back to how do you build up the foundations to allow teams to work together, to have these choices, to then be able to execute. And when we look across the business outputs, what are people trying to achieve? Of course, revenue and service, and sort of looking at lead times, looking at intake, adapting and changing can really allow healthy WYSIs, can really allow a healthy amount of inventory to then fulfill the customer's needs and have a high level of service. We've talked already about cost control, whether it comes to reducing expedited orders or removing all unnecessary air freight. But actually, in a lot of industries, we still see it today where container utilization is stuck in the mid to high 80s. And it's not that one doesn't know how to consolidate more, but it's more the complexity and the SKU level information that really blocks a lot of that cost control. Clearly, sustainable supply chains is the world that we're moving towards. We're moving towards more circular supply chains, but nonetheless, being able to track SKUs, not accelerate, and really focus on the emissions that are coming through your supply chain. And then working capital management, which feeds all the way back in again. Too much working capital will put pressure on orders, put pressure on cost control, and will impact the sustainability of your supply chain. So, how do we get to a world, and we'll talk in a moment about what we do in that world, but how do we get to a world where you have this SKU toolkit available to you? I think there's sort of three key areas. Number one is a data center. That can be an ERP, that can be supply chain software. It's somewhere that stores and understands what you're ordering at a SKU level, who your manufacturers are, etc. A lot of great companies have been built on spreadsheets and have to make that difficult transition over to ERPs or over to some type of centralized data storage system. And that's painful, but it's really important when thinking about how to optimize your supply chain. Analysis and strategy. So this is not just software, it can be data teams. In some organizations, it can be consultants, although that's typically focused more on S&OP rather than S&OE, which I think is really where the value sits. And then a connected implementation. And it's not about having some systems up here that theoretically tells you what to do, but that people down here aren't able to act on that. It's not in real time, the data's stale, the data lags. It's about how do you connect all three of those together. And if we look at what the blockers are, I think first and foremost is failed ERP implementation. I've met many CEOs who are a couple years into what they perceive to be a 5 to 10 year journey and are really worried about implementing an ERP. And what we've seen, I think this was from McKinsey, that 50 to 75% of ERP implementations fail to meet their desired objectives, and it's actually a real risk for a business. We see it across data silos, and I'm going to sort of ask that question again where I ask people to put their hands up. How many people in this room feel like there's data silos within their organization across POs, containers, SKUs, merchandising team coming to supply chain team, asking questions 120 days after? I mean, there's a lot of these data silos that live inside organizations. And then finally, skill gaps as well. I think supply chain there's really a renaissance in how interesting people find supply chain and how you can pull data analysts into supply chain, but there still is a skills gap within the industry. Great. So supply chain as a service. We believe that we're moving into this new era, this SaaS, supply chain as a service, where companies are able to deliver everything that you need to create a best-in-class supply chain. And that's focusing on how do you track, how do you optimize, and how do you implement at every stage of the supply chain, from order, from PO raised, all the way through to delivery into your DC. How do you leverage smarter SKU visibility? How do you unlock improvements in the supply chain with predictive analysis? How do you instantly execute, the point I made before about not having disconnected systems, through, in Zencargo's case, our global freight management team. And it's all based around your SKU goals. And of course, I've talked a lot about SKUs and what it looks like. So here's a real example Well, it's not 100% real because obviously we had to anonymize some of the data, but here's a near real example of what, as a freight forwarder, we're actually able to deliver back to our clients above and beyond PO tracking or above and beyond container level visibility or some form of collaboration. Actually, it's diving deep into SKUs. So this would have been a SKU that would have been highlighted to both the supply chain team, but also to the merchandising team and the specific merchandiser or merchandisers in charge of that category. Looking many weeks out and actually looking at what you expected to have as intake when you raise the order. So most ERPs have a concept where it tells you when you expect it to arrive, a required delivery date or so on. And where are those gaps emerging? And are those gaps going to be solved next week, or is there a more significant delay in those gaps? This is actually extremely powerful because this does a couple of things. Not only does it allow your merchandising team to be in context, to understand what's going on, where the gaps are going to be in terms of what's meant to be arriving a few weeks out, to work collaboratively with the supply chain team. But it also allows the supply chain team to take back control over cost, to reduce the amount of unnecessary air freight that happens, and to be smarter around consolidation and potential consolidation opportunities. And most importantly, it's meant to say number 3 down there, but aligning the different teams within an organization to make better and faster decisions. If we look at a quick case study, this is an e-commerce business, actually a really great business, scaling very quickly, a multinational business, great brand, great marketing. Problem was that their supply chain wasn't connected. The typical supply chain team versus merchandising team wasn't connected. They weren't able to effectively consolidate. Higher emissions than they should have had, which is obviously a significant threat to sort of modern day brands. And their supply chain, in essence, didn't match the ethos of what their business was trying to achieve. And through not only our technology, but our sort of freight management services and acting as a freight forwarder, we were able to reduce spend. It's actually by around 5% on the trade lanes that we were awarded through better consolidation, reduction in inefficient spending, and have a significant impact on cutting CO2 emissions. And actually, we were able to work with them to use the savings that we generate. I think we use roughly a fifth of the savings that we generate, funnel that back into CO2 emissions, and actually we're able to fully offset with a net reduction in spend, but still fully offset all the CO2 emissions on the trade lanes that we were managing. So I've talked a bunch about SKUs, and if you want to find out more, we're at stand J, but I'm going to open up to Q&A. So please, if anybody in the audience wants to ask any questions, please shoot.
Alex, a question for you. You are managing the sort of inbound mostly. Clients, they have suppliers, they have an inbound warehouse. The data that you can see is between these. And is there any occasions where you need more data beyond these legs to really help your clients to understand the skill and how it could work? And can you share any experience?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So you're right in that we manage the point from when the purchase order is raised all the way through to delivery. So the manufacturing journey, the logistics journey, let's call it 130 days, depending on the supply chain. And when you look at SKU intake, we're able to show you what's coming many weeks out versus what you expected originally when you raised the order. But in most organizations, we don't know what's happening with demand, and we don't know what's happening with your inventory level. So if you think about a Wizzy, there's 2 of the 3 blocks that we're missing. Now, from my perspective, we're still able to make a 10x improvement of what merchandisers are currently able to do and how they're able to collaborate with supply chain teams. But you're right in saying that if we could pull in demand, if we could pull in inventory, we could really actually create a virtual Wizzy or virtual stock keeping to make sure that across all the SKUs, things are healthy and we could be able to prioritize better. We're actually in a pilot with one customer about pulling in demand and pulling in inventory. I don't think we're going to come to your territory of doing returns and sort of doing the outbound from that. That's your world, and we're going to let you succeed in that. But you're right in saying the more data that we can pull in, the better it can be. But what I'll say honestly is that supply chain management is really hard. People have hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of SKUs, a very long supply chain with demand changing all the time and supply changing all the time. We look at OTIF, but if you look at SKU predictability, it's very, very low. And so the challenge that creates, even without pulling in demand and inventory, is so vast that we're able to really help our customers on that journey.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Just a comment likewise. If I focus on myself, just fulfillment and downstream. Sometimes the supply can be a constraint to my real demand, and therefore, everything can be related. That's why I'm asking the question.
Definitely. It should all be joined up eventually.
Thank you.
No worries. Any other questions? Case studies, questions around how it works in real life? I get this at the all hands in my company where people are nervous to ask questions, and usually a few moments of silence pulls a few up, so I'll just wait a few moments longer. You nearly had me fall back there with the hand raise. Great.
I'm just thinking about the coronavirus.
Yes.
How your product, how in practical terms, how could that be used and help with a situation like we've got right now?
Definitely. I think the first thing that we do is we look at SKUs, we look at intake, we look at what's likely to be affected with the best level of knowledge that we have right now. That enables merchandising teams sort of merge it into sort of looking further out in terms of their inventory. But instead of looking at a hot PO or looking at a supplier or looking at a trade lane affected, we're really able to help teams sort of focus vertically on hot SKUs and sort of go SKU by SKU in terms of looking at the intake, looking at where the deficiencies are going to lie, and then working with teams to sort of help look at, can they near source, what other options are we aware of, but it's really trying to abstract it away from very top level manufacturer or PO level conversations, which are very important, but really trying to pull it down to the SKU level as well. I think there's also the practical realities of there's a lot of offline stuff that partners like ours need to be doing in this environment, but in terms of the online solutioning, that's really how it functions. Great, well thank you so much everybody. We're at stand J if you have any more questions, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you.